Okay, numbers look like they've stopped going up now. So hi everybody, my name is Claire Gough. I'd like to welcome you to this UKCCSRC and IDRIC webinar. So my name is Claire Gough. I work for the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester, and I'm really pleased to be able to enjoy this, to introduce this IDRIC takeover webinar for the CCSRC. So for those of you who aren't familiar, IDRIC is the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre led by Mercedes Marotta-Valer at Heriot-Watt. And we've got three speakers today who'll be talking about some of the projects that have been going in Wave 2, in the Wave 1 funding from IDRIC. And we're very pleased to have Benjamin Sovacool here also, who is one of the co-directors, the three co-directors at IDRIC, who'll be introducing the kind of overall programme of IDRIC and the kind of more social science projects as well. And then we'll zoom into more detail on three of the specific projects. So I'm very pleased to have Benjamin here. He's a professor of energy policy at SPRU, which is a science policy research unit at the University of Sussex. And he's got a very wide-ranging and illustrious research career so far, covering global energy policy, politics, energy security, energy justice, climate change mitigation and adaptation. And he's also a co-author on the IPCC 6 assessment report. So over to you, Benjamin.
Thank you very much. And I think you just need to disable screen sharing, or enable it, I mean, so I can share my wonderful slides. So there it goes. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. We're also trying out these really neat new slides that IDRIC has provided, which you can see here. And it's really a pleasure for me to highlight the social science work that we're doing. So I figured there might be some people here who don't know what IDRIC is. So I thought I would start with a very high level take. So IDRIC is the Industrial Decarbonization Research and Innovation Center. And its aim is to realize green futures. That's kind of our tagline, green futures realized in UK's industrial clusters, which tends to mean these kind of 7 geographic clusters, as well as different dispersed sites. And it is funded by the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. And it's meant to be very, very collaborative. We have more than 80 industrial partners. We have more than 40 different universities and other institutions involved. And as I'll talk about today, we're really about whole systems, multidisciplinary research on net zero in an industrial context. So as I mentioned, it's pretty well funded, and it takes a geographic approach that is focused on these different clusters. And we have 20 million pounds in direct funding from UKRI and another 10 million pounds from industry co-funding. So it is a 30 million pound center. And we currently have 3 different tranches of funding. I'm presenting today, and everyone here today is presenting phase 1. We have phase 2, which we're currently evaluating, and we have a flex fund for early career researchers, which we're about to launch and evaluate in early 2023. IDRIC is being funded along with other elements of UKRI's strategy for net zero industry. They're putting in almost 180 million pounds into deployment projects, and they're putting in another 8 million pounds into kind of cluster roadmaps and cluster development plans. As Claire mentioned, we have a champion who is Mercedes Marotta-Valer. She leads IDRIC with support from 3 co-directors, myself, Anna Cora from Imperial, and Marcel McManus from Bath. And you can see here are the high level numbers: 142 partners, 74 from industry, 23 from universities, 35 from different NGOs, 10 from policymakers. And like I said, this will probably increase by another 30 or 40% with the current wave 2 of funding, which will bring in more universities, more partners, and more associations. In our original proposal, we had structured all of our research. So we had more than 90 proposals for IDRIC projects, and we ended up funding, as I said, more than 40. And we divided them into 3 research innovation themes. And that's what you see on the left. You have low carbon technologies, which is really about natural and physical sciences and engineering and prototyping. You have systems and scale up, which is life cycle assessment, finance, and other things. And then finally, you have social, economic, and policy on the far left. We pegged each of these RITs to 1 co-director. So I'm co-director of the far left theme, which, as you can tell, is really where most of the social science is housed, covering policies and business models, innovation and learning, social acceptance, trust, awareness, even incumbency, politics, resistance to change, sense of place. All of it goes in our research and innovation theme. And then, based on feedback from EPSRC, they didn't like us only having themes. They were concerned that this would create silos, as in we'd all only talk to each other in RIT1. So they decided to create MIPS, multidisciplinary integrated programs. Each project, perhaps confusingly, sits in an RIT as well as a MIP. So they double sit. And this is designed to create more multidisciplinary collaboration. And there are social science projects in every single MIP. I did this last night. This shows you from IDRIC, out of those 40 plus projects, the 25 that actually identify themselves as being social science. Again, we didn't validate this. It wasn't our classification. This is the PIs themselves put words in like social science, economics, policy, et cetera. So it gives you a real sense for the diversity. And it also shows, like I said earlier, how social science is embedded in every single MIP. And we do have other presenters here, Marc, Hudson, Lynn, who are on this list, and Patrick as well, who will present some of this work, or at least talk about some of this work later today. To give you a flavor for what types of social science projects IDRIC is supporting, we're going to hear more about this from Marc, but we're looking at things like CCS or hydrogen, how they have these cycles of hype and expectations, as well as, how they're affected by policy streams and policy windows. We'll hear more about that in a moment. People like Nick and Karen and Harriet are looking at things like psychology and risk and how people understand decarbonization, especially in South Wales, in insecure times. And you can see here how they're doing a lot of work on energy biographies and lived experiences, places and spaces, and things like reindustrialization in a context like post-Brexit, post-COVID, where we're already dealing with costs of living crises and destabilizing global events. And the project is kind of capturing how people view uncertainty, as well as their kind of narratives and aspirations to have better, more sustainable, financially secure lives in an era of industrial change. Patrick and Lynn are going to talk about this as well, where we're talking about net zero and kind of sense of place, right? Where we're looking at a place-based agenda, whether it's places or super places or super clusters, looking at, again, people's different sense making and place branding with a lot of embedded work, ethnography, focus groups, stakeholder workshops in the clusters. I couldn't not mention Clair's project as well, which I really like because it's kind of connecting things like strategic niche management, protective spaces, as well as the social license to operate, which is really good at looking again at citizens and kind of social acceptance of how people actually perceive or resist different low carbon innovations in two different clusters, Merseyside and HyNet, and the Humber, as well as all of the industries attached there, with really, really nice cluster mapping reports, as well as connections to things like power and trust and party politics. Neil Strachan and Brunhilde are looking at another element, which is more political economy of net zero, kind of sunrise and sunset, who wins and who loses, whose assets are stranded, what financial skills are available, what co-benefits are there, who's capturing the co-benefits, as well as perhaps who opposes decarbonization. How are experiments ongoing, and how is it affecting those broader structures in place at the UK level for decarbonization? And finally, one of my own projects, which I won't talk about more today, is on smart policy and governance, where I'm working with Frank Heels at Manchester and Marfuga Iskandarova at Sussex, where we're really looking at patterns of kind of spatial cluster decarbonization. And that's what's unique about IDRIC, is it isn't just by sector, and it isn't just by technology. It's multi-technology, multi-sector. And the way that IDRIC approaches this is by these geographic clusters, which have a great diversity of emissions profiles and industrial activities. And that's kind of nice. It's a place-based approach to decarbonization that is almost unlike anywhere else in the world. And we think that there's a lot of promise and lessons already that the UK can have, as we've explicated here in this policy forum 2 weeks ago in the journal Science. And it's also a surprisingly innovative space where we see a lot of smart policy mechanisms being piloted, tested, and trialed, whether it's regulatory asset-based models, or carbon border tariff adjustments, or differentiated strike prices for hydrogen or carbon, right? As well as the kind of piloting of other more smaller scale business models. So the UK is really a world-leading laboratory for net zero. And again, this is my last slide. It really comes back, and these projects indicate all of them are multidisciplinary. All of them are mixed methods and multi-methods, and all of them are tackling these different cross-cutting issues that remain at the heart of what IDRIC is trying to do. And it's why really, even though it's funded by EPSRC, right, 25 of our existing Wave 1 projects touch on social science in some way, and we really are, I think, at the cutting edge of net zero research. And with that, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Benjamin. That was a really great overview of some of the really exciting work that's going on at IDRIC. And, you know, just to reiterate, it is brilliant to see how much social science and how different the social science projects are across the programme. So I'm going to, there's plenty of time for questions later. If you do have questions, please do put them in the chat. And what we'll do is we'll run through all the speakers. We'll then have a 10-minute break around 3 o'clock or so, and then come back and have a longer chance for a discussion and questions afterwards. So if you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat and we'll collect them all up towards the end. So now we're moving on to much more detail on the actual kind of projects that we've got. We've got 3 projects that are reporting today, some very early results on after the longest any of the projects have been running is around a year now. So this is really the first chance to see some of the results of these projects. So we've first got 2 speakers from the first project. So Patrick Devine-Wright, maybe familiar to a lot of you, is an environmental social scientist based at the University of Exeter. And he has a primary interest in social acceptance of energy transitions, community engagement and place attachment. He's also the director of the new Access Leadership Team, which is a £6.25 million ESRC funded programme. And he is also a author on the AR6 IPCC report. And then his colleague, Huei-Ling, or Lynn as she's known as, is also a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Geography at Exeter, working with Patrick on the IDRIC Net Zero Sense of Place project, which we'll be talking about later. And she is a political scientist and human geographer specialising in placemaking dynamics and community-based projects of sustainability. So thank you. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Claire. And yeah, looking forward to talking through some very early findings from our project, I would emphasize. And thanks for the introduction to the whole program and to the social science element in particular, Benjamin. So yes, this is kind of an early look at the project that we're involved in here. And I guess the key thing to say is that it is about that word place. And mapping in particular. So we're taking a kind of a geography perspective on the clusters. And I would emphasize that this is early work in progress. We're sharing early findings with you and seeing how we get on. And the presentation today is going to be given to you by both of us. So I'll introduce and then hand over to my colleague, Lynn, and we'll share our findings in that way. So you can see the topic there, mapping cluster imaginaries. And so we are interested in maps because of our geography approach. Who produces them? How are they used? What do they mean? What do they tell us about the way in which clusters are imagined and change over time? And I think we've tweaked this presentation to be of particular relevance to the carbon capture kind of audience. So we would note that as well. Yeah, so if we could move on to the next slide, please, Lynn. So what we're going to do essentially is give you a very brief overview of the project generally and the first phase of research, empirical research in it. So we'll talk about this concept of sense of place and what a place-based approach to industrial cluster decarbonization might look like. And we'll have 3 strands of findings to explain. One is looking at how different stakeholders involved in 3 case study clusters are imagining what that cluster looks like. What does it mean? How is it named? And when we talk about emplacing the cluster, we're interested in its geographical and locational components. Where is it imagined to be? What are its boundaries or borders, if any? Do they cross existing political and administrative borders? Where is its center? And what do maps tell us about that? And what do different stakeholders from different sectors tell us about that? So we'll talk about that a bit more. And then finally, we'll have a look at the role of CCS in particular in shaping the imaginary of of industrial clusters to different degrees, depending on the role it plays and the kind of structure of the clusters. So we'll share all of that with some concluding remarks and hope that you find it of interest. So I'm just going to give you a very brief overview on this idea of place and sense of place before I hand over to my colleague Lynn. So the key thing here is to, I guess, take forward some of the remarks that Benjamin mentioned already. It is, of course, very conventional and very normal to imagine clusters as activities that involve multiple sectors and activities that involve multiple technologies. But if you take a place-based approach, you add something to that, and that's a kind of an ontology, a different ontology. So you see the world through the eyes of places and locations that matter. And of course, this is particularly relevant to industrial cluster decarbonization, because if clusters are anything, they are co-located facilities. So they are in some kind of place, but what is that place? And if we look at clusters in the making, we are also seeing places being made and remade over time. And so that's quite an interesting thing to pick up on. So when we talk about sense of place, we're talking about the way in which places get imagined and branded by stakeholders, including local authorities and companies, but also it's about the people who live on the ground, the people who might feel emotionally attached to those places and have a strong connection to it and sense of place. What kind of place is it? And how do those two different perspectives interact? So our methodology is systematically designed to pick up on those different directions and experiences. And in this early phase that we're going to be sharing with you today, phase one, we're drawing on the stakeholder perspective on that through the use of the qualitative methodology of semi-structured interviews. We have 3 case studies that we're comparing: South Wales, Scotland, and the Northwest. And we have conducted diverse stakeholder interviews across each of those cases. And the key thing I've mentioned about our methodology for this first phase is that it wasn't just a typical interview process in the sense that we introduced maps into the interview process. We shared different versions through maps of the cluster over time as produced by different stakeholders. And we'll tell you something about the findings of those interviews just now. So with that, I will hand over to my colleague Lynn, who will begin to tell you some more about our concrete findings as they are emerging. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lynn, and I'm going to show you some findings that we have for the current stage. And I will start with the question about how stakeholders imagine an industrial cluster. So as Benjamin mentioned, that the UK's approach toward industrial decarbonization is very special because it is a cluster-based approach. And we ask what on earth is a cluster? And then when we look into the cluster document discourses or the stakeholder interviews, we found that the idea of industrial cluster is not straightforward, but multifaceted and diverse. So you can see on the table in the slide that they have different dimensions and different meanings. Because of time, I will just quickly jump to our next part. And so actually, besides the multifaceted dimensions of the meaning of a cluster, when we talk to the industrial stakeholders, we constantly found ourselves wondering, wait a minute, which kind of cluster they are talking about? And this question we have is actually related to the fact that there are 2 government funding schemes that use the term cluster, and they refer to 2 different types of cluster imaginaries. So the first one is UKRI's Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, which just like Benjamin mentioned, they involve the cluster plan projects and the deployment projects, as well as IDRIC. And the other one is the so-called Check One cluster, which is funded by BASE with the aim to develop 2 operational CCUS clusters by the mid-2020s. So for the Check One cluster on this scheme, that it was specifically targeted on CCUS development, and we will go back later in our presentation. So that when we talk to the stakeholders, people will refer to either ISCF cluster or Check One cluster, and you have to figure out, okay, which one do they refer to? And also in terms of ISCF related cluster, there are 2 dimensions: cluster plan and the deployment projects. So it's actually a little bit confusing. So for especially because IDRIC is belong to ICF funding. So when we talk to the stakeholders about the cluster plan and deployment project, we found like sometimes there's a confusion between these two, especially in the case where there's a mega deployment project. So for instance, like a HyNet project in the Northwest cluster, if you talk to a stakeholder who mainly focus or working with the deployment project, probably they will talk about HyNet cluster. You will hear the term HyNet cluster, but what they mean is actually the infrastructure institution stakeholders later is kind of organized around the HyNet project. But if you talk to people who work on the cluster plan, the so-called Northwest cluster plan, then they will say, yes, HyNet is very important part of it, but it's not the everything of the cluster. The cluster is actually bigger. So they have two different kinds of imaginaries, and sometimes they don't really communicate with each other, but even though there's some kind of overlap in terms of membership, but still there's lots of confusions. And in cases of SWIC, this is different, slightly different, because in the case of a SWIC, the South Wales Industrial Cluster, there's not a huge mega deployment project. And then the deployment project and the cluster plan kind of work together, and they were both named as SWIC. So they both identified with the brand SWIC. And so you probably don't find much confusion there. Whereas in the case of a Scottish cluster is again different, because the Scottish cluster was a brand that was promoted during the competition for the Check One cluster in 2021. So you can see the logo here. And it was kind of a campaign led by ACOM project partners, which is also the lead of the deployment project. So when you talk to people in Scotland about cluster, they will refer to the Check One cluster, not the ISCF cluster. So yeah, I know that this may sound a bit confusing, but don't worry, because it's also confusing for people who are really working on these cluster buildings. And so now we are moving from the concept to the clusters that were taking place on the ground. We found 3 ways that a cluster can be in place. The first one is to name a cluster after a place. And you can see some examples in the 2 maps on the right-hand side. And these 2 maps are, one is about clusters by emission, and the right one is the cluster by the decarbonization projects. And you can see that there is some difference in terms of the name of the cluster. So on the left side, the relatively old map is called Merseyside, and on the right-hand side is Northwest. And also in terms of, you can see Grange Mouse is changed to Scotland on the right-hand side. And so you can see the naming of a cluster is actually evolving, and it can be contested. And we would like to highlight the point that it's very important to get the name right, because as the code at the bottom shows, if you get the name wrong, then you may create a misleading cluster, imaginary, different geographical connotations, like where it is located, what is its geographical coverage, and who should you talk to. And you can maybe go to the wrong local authorities who probably don't know that much about the cluster. And it also make some stakeholders feel frustrated because they feel their efforts in cluster building is not recognized. And a second way to in place a cluster is through building the cluster architecture with place-based projects. So we know that as industrial decarbonization doesn't take place in a tabula rasa, a cluster architecture is largely shaped by existing industrial locations, supply chains, and existing energy industrial infrastructures. And we found 2 types of cluster architectures in our 3 case studies. So the one is about based on a single mega project like ACOM project in Scotland. So in the case of Scotland, they started with the ACOM storage on the North Sea. And then because this is a very huge CO2 storage space, they need to find some emission to make it work. And there's not much emission in St. Fergus where the Acorn storage part is kind of based. So they needed to look down to Grange Mouse, and then they bring in the transport part to this Acorn project. And because the emission in Scotland is relatively small compared with other clusters in the UK, so they also introduced CO2 shipping from other parts of the UK or from Europe to this project. And so in Scotland, you will see much more international connections than other clusters. And by contrast, in South Wales, where there's no CO2 storage, they have to rely on CO2 shipping to other places, to other industrial storage, CO2 storages. And also the industrial sites in these areas is located dispersedly along the South Wales coast. So they decide to develop a multi-centric model, which composed of 4 to 5 mini clusters in different industrial areas in this region, and develop them at the same time. So they kind of followed a more decentralized horizontal architecture. And the third way to implement a cluster is through mapping. And like Patrick mentioned, when we talk to our stakeholders, we show the maps that we found very most telling ones from the documents and websites, and ask where do they think the cluster is located, what is the center, and how can it expand in future. And then we found that there's no consensus about all these questions. Different stakeholders have different imaginaries about like where it will be located. So for instance, you can see these two maps from the Northwest cluster. If you talk to people who work mainly on the cluster plan, they will identify the map on the left, this one, as more accurate because it shows the whole region of the Northwest England. But if you talk to people working mainly on HyNet project, they will identify the right map as the more accurate one because it shows the infrastructure of the HyNet, and it doesn't really involve places like Cumbria or Lancashire that is not yet in the reach of the HyNet project. And you can also see that administrative boundary is kind of downplayed in these maps because for the industrial stakeholders, administrative boundary is not actually very important in terms of from the perspective of project development, and it sometimes will become a kind of limit for their expansion, and they will have to tackle different local authorities, etc. So interestingly, we see that there's kind of a tension between project boundary and the administrative boundaries. And then that's the part I would like to talk about is the CCUS cluster imaginary. So in addition to the diverse cluster imaginaries among stakeholders on the ground, the UK government also encouraged a particular cluster imaginary with the clustering sequencing process, so the so-called track 1 process, to facilitate the development of CCUS. And as the quote here shows, CCUS cluster is defined as a transport and storage network, meaning pipelines and also the offshore storage space facilities, and also the projects for carbon capture. So it is very pipeline-based cluster imaginary, and is focused on the domestic and regional sources of carbon dioxide. And for the within our 3 cluster cases, HyNet and in the Northwest cluster fit into this cluster imaginary very well. And they were one of the 2 track 1 clusters that was awarded with the government support to start to speed up their development. But for other 2 clusters that we started, they are not really fit into this cluster imaginaries, and they will kind of be excluded from the track 1 process. And this is a little bit frustrating for them because it shows that they cannot speed up their development, and they may, as a result, become less attractive to their investors, and they can have some kind of devastating consequences for their cluster development and local industrial development. And ironically, if you think about, actually, by these 2 clusters, one involved the largest CO2 storage in the UK, and one includes one is the home to the largest single emitters in the UK. Both of them are left out from the process and kind of been delayed. So just raise a question about, is this really useful to think cluster in terms of a CCU clusters? So I will hand this ground back to Patrick to make the conclusion.
Thanks, Lynn. And aware of time, I'll rattle through this final slide then. So I think the point we've been trying to get across here is that when one moves beyond simply looking at sectors or technologies and takes a place-based approach to industrial cluster decarbonization, we then start to interrogate who and where the clusters are imagined to be. And what we're finding from this preliminary phase of work is that they're not at all self-evident. It depends on who you speak to and when you speak to them, and clearly reflecting some interesting differences as well as similarities between our 3 cluster case studies here. Now, there are very interesting naming geographical connotations. Even some back and forth in the chat about what exactly is the name of the Northwest cluster is consistent with this idea that there's quite a lot of flexibility and ambiguity and evolution over time in how these clusters look and how they're described. And those geographical connotations are extremely important. Where are the boundaries? Is North Wales in the Northwest cluster? And how does Wales map onto industrial decluster carbonization are very important things to pick up. CCUS cluster imaginaries are important too. They help shape, but also potentially constrain the development of a cluster to the extent that storage is definitely involved or mega projects are definitely involved. So that's what we found. And so some early conclusions from us, I think, would be that policymakers must retain a sensitivity to these different types of spatialities emerging from these imaginaries of the clusters and reflect upon the strengths, but also sometimes the weaknesses, ambiguities, and frustrations that come with those over time. And as I said, this is just the first phase. Our next phase is going into communities in each of these 3 cluster case studies in Grangemouth, Ellesmere Port, and in Milford Haven to investigate what these clusters look like on the ground in terms of lived experience and the connections with those places that are named or not, as the case may be, in industrial cluster decarbonisation. So thank you very much indeed on behalf of both of us.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Lynn. It's really exciting to see these results actually and how they kind of marry to some of the results that we've got from our workshop. So I'll hold myself back. So we're going to move straight on to Benjamin again now, who's going to talk about the Just Transitions project. It's Just Transitions for Industrial Decarbonisation in the UK, which is a project he leads with Exeter again, and also colleagues at the University of Manchester. So again, if you've got any questions, please do put those in the chat. It's great to see dialogue building up already in the chat, so that's really great. Keep that going. And I'll hand over to you again, Benjamin.
Claire, and I just want to compliment Patrick on his dressing choices because we appear to be dressed identically. So nice dress shirt, Patrick. You've got excellent taste. So yes, it's now a pleasure to talk about Just Transitions. And as Claire was saying, it is a project that we're doing with Exeter. So Patrick and Stasia Ryder, Manchester, Sarah Mander is helping us. And I thought it would start, we've been hearing a lot this term Just Transitions, and you may have also heard terms like climate justice or energy justice. So I really wanted to kind of hammer in on what the heck it means. And I really like the most recent IPCC report because it tries to actually give a good definition as to what a just transition is, one that I fully endorse. So according to the IPCC, a just transition is a set of principles or processes or practices that try to make sure that no one is left behind in a decarbonized economy. And by no one, I mean workers, employees, places, sectors, countries, or even regions. So it's a communities of practice, communities of place. It's a very kind of inclusive term. It really stresses that we need to kind of create proactive and targeted governance to make sure that we manage negative impacts. And again, impacts can be broad: social, environmental, cultural, economic. And it is underlined by these kind of really nice normative principles: respect, recognition, dignity, fairness, social dialogue, consultation, decent work, social protection, human rights. What's not to support, right? And that means that it can become quite a useful heuristic that can steer energy planning, land use planning, climate policy making, training, retraining, gender, equitable outcomes, even cooperation and coordination. And finally, there's a strand of it, which we actually endorse as well, that it's also about undoing previous harms and actually providing some form of redress, whether it's compensation or recognition or some other input that helps create corrective justice. One of the ways that just transitions have been mapped is by looking at different social movements and organizations. And I'm just struck by the diversity of actors here, right? There are global actors, there are actors in Africa, actors in Australia, actors in North America, actors here in Europe and Germany. And another way is to formally map not social movements, but actual just transition commissions, just transition task forces, just transition dialogues. And this shows you, as of this year, some notable ones, including in the UK, because we have the Just Transition Commission in Scotland, which is actually headed by Professor Jim Skee, as well as significant support from the European Union, who actually has their Just Transitions Fund as part of the European Green Deal. So that's the kind of global backdrop. Just Transition offers really important framework to put equity in the center of our discussions, and it's building on this global movement around the world, which is even increasing in its momentum today. So our project is trying to take just transition and put it in an industrial context. We want to look at within IDRIC, what are some of the communities and workers who are vulnerable? What are some of the prescriptive things we can do, new technologies, new policies, new forms of collaboration that can protect them? And how can we guide future decarbonization pathways with a focus on justice, which may even be just transition roadmaps? To do it, we didn't have enough time and enough resources to focus on all of the clusters, so we chose 3, one in Scotland, Grangemouth, one in England, Merseyside, although now maybe it's called Hainet or Northwest, and one in South Wales. In each of these clusters, we've tried to adhere to this kind of really multi-pronged research methodology where we start with a systematic review. I'll show you the results of that. We are in the middle of this kind of data collection in the communities themselves, and we will be doing workshops and roadmaps in 2023, with synthesis work coming near the end of the project, which is June of 2023. You can see here, this kind of tells you about our multi-methods approach, which I quite like. We're a big fan of mixed methods within the work that we do. And so we are doing document analysis, looking at things like the history of these places, what are the industrial community relations, what are the different strategies groups are using. We are then doing semi-structured interviews with community members. With participant observation, we've kind of doing light embedded ethnography, where each of our researchers has taken one cluster and we've embedded 3 of them in each of the clusters. And finally, we are in the middle of designing a survey, which is a nationally representative survey with about 2,000 respondents, with an oversampling of each of the 3 specific clusters, Grangemouth, Northwest, and South Wales. The first output, which is already complete, was a systematic review where Paul Upham, myself, and Bialpashi Ghosh from University of Sussex led a desk-based review to look at just transitions, but what it might mean in a decarbonization framework. And what we did there is we immediately identified different disciplines. So we have here 3 core literatures, right, which each have different disciplinary groundings. We have the justice literature, which is ethics and law. We have the kind of transitions literature, which is transition studies and innovation studies. And we have the community and democracy literature, which is kind of energy policy, sociology, and political science. And we found that each of them has a different foci. Each of them has different units of analysis. Each of them has different concepts. So it's kind of nice. It gives you 3 perspectives, each which brings something different into focus. But, and you can also see here, we then inductively looked within the literature for cross-cutting themes. And these are the 5 themes that came out of this broader corpus of literature, some of which are in all 3 of those different perspectives, many of which capitalism and institutions are in at least 2 of them. However, one of the other things that we found is that while each of these perspectives on just transitions has something in focus, it also has something out of focus. So while it has really good fits with coherent explanatory power, it also has, for lack of a better term, misfits with weak explanatory power. So this is the value of juxtaposing different perspectives together so that you get a more holistic point that brings everything into focus. And that looks like this, where you can see our different 5 themes, and then even within those themes, sub-themes, which we believe belong in an industrial decarbonization just transitions framework. Trust, politics, finance, democracy, planning, values, and perceived losses of amenities. And what we're now doing, because I know I'm almost out of time, is applying that framework to then answer some remaining research questions about challenges that communities are facing to ongoing industrial decarbonization, including what are some of the strategies we can harness to ameliorate those injustices, what are their expectations, and how can we better calibrate policy. And as I said, we're in the middle of designing a survey which will oversample the 3 clusters, which will not only look at demographics and their familiarity with key technologies like carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, but also things like stance detection, what are their attitudes, justice dimensions, what are their senses of what is morally right and wrong, equitable and unequitable, governance questions about what policy mechanisms we want to harness, and place-specific questions unique to each of the clusters that also map onto very well values. And so we're really excited to be running this and hope to have some results in early of 2023. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email me or my co-investigator, Abigail Martin, who also helped put together the presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. That's really interesting to see. We'll look forward to see the results of those 2 bits of empirical work as well. Really exciting. So we've got Marc Hudson lined up next from SPRU again at the University of Sussex, looking at industrial decarbonisation policy. So Marc completed his PhD in Manchester with us on the question of incumbent resistance to socio-technical transitions. And if anyone's interested, he also has a website on climate histories, which is called allouryesterdays.info. Really pleased that you could join us in person, Marc. That's great. Over to you.
Right. The politics of industrial decarbonisation policy. And there are 4 screenshots here which matter. On the left, we have the cancellation, the infamous cancellation in 2015 of the second CCS competition. In the middle, we have 2 efforts at sort of returning CCS to primacy in UK climate and energy policy. And then over here on the right, the cluster sequencing, which we're all familiar with. So I'm very quickly going to talk about who we are, what we studied, how we studied it, and crucially, what we learned and why it matters. My email is there, and so is my Twitter for as long as Twitter lasts. So the PI on the project is Matthew Lockwood, who should need no introduction. He sends his apologies. I'm not going to continue to introduce myself, but if you ever need someone who can juggle balls and clubs while talking about climate policy, I might well be your man. So, as many people on the call will know better than me, CCS has had a very long and tempestuous history, and the cancellation of the second competition I alluded to earlier really was an existential moment. In one of the interviews I've conducted fairly recently, someone really laid out just how close the whole thing was to folding. And yet the puzzle is, 3 years later in Edinburgh, the Minister of State Clair is extolling CCS's virtues, and it seems like all systems go. So we, Matthew and I, decided we wanted to discuss the how, why, and who questions around this recovery. And we used something called multiple streams approach, which some of you will be very familiar with, and I will explain. We focus very much on national policy around CCS. So industrial decarbonisation is broader than that. It also includes, reducing emissions from energy efficiency, material substitution. But the argument that we've heard from CCS advocates is that will only get you so far. If you really want to get to 80% or net zero, as we now need, you're going to need CCS. Now, we didn't look carefully at the formation of the cluster organizations because they kind of, on the whole, with one perhaps exception, were happening later than the period that we were really focusing on, which was 2015 to 18. And I should say that just because we looked at national policy doesn't mean we were only looking at people who stalked the halls of Whitehall and Westminster. Regional actors were very, very important. So we drew on the multiple streams, which I will explain. We did lots of reading, far too much reading. We figured out a chronology, key moments, pivot points. We interviewed some people. We did some more reading and then more interviews. And it's really occurred to me recently just how important these are, because the documents will only take you so far and you can only form educated guesses. the interviews have been crucial. So that very quickly, the multiple streams approach. This was formulated 35 years ago by a chap looking at US health policy, but it has been used a lot, especially by climate scholars. And it suggests that you can look at things with a problem stream where scientists and campaigning groups are saying, hey, look, there's a problem. A politics stream where especially political parties are jostling for legitimacy, looking for problems that they can be seen to be solving ahead of the next election. And you have a policy stream with think tanks and academics and so forth who have their own pet ways of solving the world's issues. It might be emissions trading, it might be regulation, it might be a technology, who are constantly trying to match their solution to a problem. And these three streams can continue thicker and thinner independently of each other, but every so often they're coupled by what Kingdon called a policy entrepreneur, who brings the streams together, basically gets everyone in the same room, needs luck, needs judgment, needs status, but then you get what's called a policy window, where the issue is being talked about not just by junior ministers and junior civil servants, but by the big beasts. And that's what we are articulating for CCS here. There is, as I alluded to earlier, a longer history. This window on the left you see that closed in 2015 was not the first window for CCS. We then, via this iterative process, divided it into 4 periods before the opening of the second window. And very quickly, there's an initial, what the heck just happened? How did Treasury cut us off at the knees? Oh my God, what do we do? Period. And then there's a response that the UKCCSRC was quite important in, I'm not just saying that, where discussions around, well, you know, we can do this cheaply, we need to do this cheaply enough, hit their stride. There's a third period after the production of the Oxborough report, which seems very quiet, but actually behind the scenes a lot was going on. And then we argue that from the October 2017 with the clean growth strategy, you begin to see a coupling of the 3 streams, and by a year later, the next window has opened up, and that next window is still open. So I don't have time to go through all 4 of the periods, but a couple of bits from the latter period. We've discovered, to no one's surprise perhaps, that there are always tensions with Treasury, and we have a quote here from someone familiar with the process. I can't say who they are, obviously, but this is a reflection on the internal, interdepartmental politics that were going on ahead of the production of one of the big important documents. And there's always lots of jostling going on. In this instance, what happened was that the elite political actors were able to sort of clear the blockages, talk to each other, maybe over the heads of some of the civil servants, and get things going. So the coupling process was really interesting to us, and the clean growth strategy, which really brings back a sense of momentum and possibility around CCS, and alludes to the language of clusters, which had been called hubs when the Oxford report was produced. Crucially, the clean growth strategy led to a CCUS council. It was not the first one. There had been development forums and all sorts of other groups, a coal task force going back. And crucially, this thing called a cost challenge task force, which really was where everyone got in the room, lots of companies, trade associations, etc. And Bays, who were in charge of the process, were really a little taken aback at how much enthusiasm there was for CCS in sort of 2017-18, though it should be said there was a lot of suspicion too from companies, understandably. So let's compare 2015, 2019 and onwards. In 2015, there were a relatively small number of actors in the CCS ecosystem. There were 2 projects, both of which were point-to-point. And as you know, CCS was extremely vulnerable to political headwinds. It didn't have enough allies, and the business model was, shall we say, rudimentary. But by 2019, you've really seen an evolution, a development, many more actors, much more attention being paid to business models. So on the home stretch now, what we've learned is that advocates for CCS worked assiduously on the price question and pushed for varying business models. And here I should mention that the Teesside Collective, which no longer exists, was really proactive on, it commissioned work about business models and basically shoved it under the noses of the relevant civil servants and ministers and said, here, look, you know, it's doable. The much bigger network of advocates, they used the venues that were available to them, and you could argue they even created some venues. And they tied the CCS technology to a narrative of industrial growth, regional economic development, jobs, and crucially, the industrial clusters. And they tied CCS to hydrogen as well, and the people advocating hydrogen also got in on that act. So why it matters, a few closing thoughts. We should remember that policy interest is contingent and that windows close. Windows have been fragile. We should recognize that there's been a big bottom-up effort from various actors, including the academics. And we should, I would argue that the moments when the state kind of opens up its policymaking process are really important and have been successfully used, I didn't want to say exploited, but used by advocates. Final plug for myself, rationales for CCS in the UK are changing or have changed over time, and you can read all about it in a piece that I've got coming out in the conversation imminently. So what next? Well, hopefully to answer your questions, or at least to respond to them, to get published in those 4-star journals that mean you continue to be an academic, and fingers crossed studying capture as a service. Again, if you've any questions, observations, critiques, hot tips, here's my email, and thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That's brilliant and brought us completely back onto time again. So that's absolutely perfect. So we're going to have a 10-minute break now. If you could come back promptly, we probably don't need 10 minutes. So if you could come back really promptly by 3:10, keep putting your questions in the chat and we'll run through those and try and kind of bring everybody into a discussion, bring all our speakers together. That would be lovely. So we'll see you in 10 minutes, 3:10. Thank you.